A first look at how different backfields might shake out and how to play them in redraft. That's what we're going to be talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And Shawn, we talked about Dynasty a little bit last couple weeks. Obviously, it's a big best ball time of year, and certainly we'll be doing some best ball content, probably some types of drafts as some upcoming streams and things like that. We wanted to crack open the redraft discussion at this point and emphasize that mainly because the best ball and redraft are two very different concepts. Now, we're mostly going to talk about players, but the ways that you may play the different positions in these different formats are going to be different. I mean, we were just talking before we went live here about some of the different backfields and some of the different situations. I brought up Rico Dowdle last year, who was an interesting play for some people in best ball because of the way that it seemed that he would get a good amount of work. And he did get a good amount of work. He didn't have a huge year, didn't score a lot of touchdowns, those things. However much of a hit he was or not, your mileage may vary on that. But I think unquestionably he's a good example. What he was last year, what his profile was going into the year. He's a good example of the type of pick that I could see myself making in best ball, but still thought was a bad pick in managed leagues because of a lack of upside and because of the way that the reason for that is in best ball, you don't get to then figure out who's going to get the touches if it's not someone in all of these fragile backfields and the sort of dead zone back types where what you're fading is this concept of guaranteed touches. Sometimes those touches go to players that are not even on the radar in draft season. They emerge in season. I said to you, you go way back to my first dead zone piece over at CBS. And one of the first parts of that, I always, bring this up every now and then, but one of the first parts of this, the way that I hooked the concept, my first paragraph was that the year prior, Alex Collins was going in the top 100 picks because everybody thought he was going to get he was projected to get the bulk of the work for the Baltimore Ravens. He had finished the year prior as their lead back. And nobody saw this UDFA Gus Edwards coming as the guy that would get 150 touches. And so when you were doing your projections, you couldn't project this UDFA back that you knew was on the roster, but you didn't know much about for 150 touches. And so then you wind up giving them all to Alex Collins, and then it sort of emphasize or you're a little bit overconfident in Alex Collins' particular profile because his profile wasn't particularly strong. He had just kind of been the lead back to close the prior year. And that's sort of the whole point of this concept of, the guaranteed touches or the role that's there. That kind of a role can matter more in best ball because you can't identify the UDFA that's going to get 150 touches in best ball season. So you are just trying to find some running backs that may actually get touches in some cases. We talked about how that's maybe misunderstood as well. You made a great point that in some cases, those players aren't even great for best ball because they're not getting enough of a ceiling. There's too much emphasis put on their floor. Anyway, we're not talking about best ball today. What we are talking about is the backfields, or at least the backfields that we find on an early look are interesting, how they may evolve throughout the season in 2025, what players might emerge, what types of things we might expect. A lot of this discussion is going to include the rookies, obviously, in a tremendous rookie running back class, and they landed a lot of spots where the big discussion point right now for best ball or managed, where the value is going to come in these backfields, because that's going to be key. I mean, also, even in best ball, where the late season points are, everyone cares about weeks 15 to 17. It doesn't matter what type of fantasy football you're playing. Who's going to be scoring all those points? Who's this year's Bucky Irving, right? That's going to be good early, starting to make his name, and then late, like the guy, in his backfield. And again, that's not going to just focus on the rookies. It's going to be a discussion of a lot of the different running backs and how we think the entire league looks and how we want to play it. But with, again, a focus on redraft, on this idea that if we want to fade a guy, we're just fading him, even if he might have the potential to have a lot of touches. But because we don't think there's a lot of a ceiling there, and because there's some running backs that are going to emerge every season that nobody's really talking about during draft season, and they wind up being pretty key parts of the fantasy puzzle and particularly the redraft puzzle. So anyway, that's the long-winded introduction of what we're doing today. Now I got to bring you in. How you doing?
Good. I've been working on sort of well, hopefully it ends up being an epic piece. I've been working on an article that includes all of my rankings for redraft. So it's framed as this early Big Gorilla piece, the Big Gorilla, the 350 level redraft contest for the FFPC this season. We'll have the rankings. It'll have the tiers. It gives you the priority targets. It gives you what I consider to be the most important stat and or context for each non-rookie. We've done so much rookie content. I'm not just going to throw all of that back in again, but for these veterans, through like 200, right? The top 200 players, put them in the context. And obviously, Ben, you try and keep that to like 2 or 3 sentences, because otherwise you're talking about a novel length piece. I don't want people to work through that. But it's been a lot of fun, because trying to distill everything about a player's season, maybe even their career, and how that then comes into their 2025 context, what the most important piece is, and what they're dealing with in terms of being able to be over or undervalued. That's been a lot of fun. And one of the things that I have done is actually change the rankings somewhat significantly on a handful of players after working through that. You will go in, and even if you've written all the articles that you and I have written, you've watched every game as you and I have done, there are some times where the thesis that you had on a player and you're about to write up, like, that's actually not quite the case. And I need to make sure I'm understanding that and reflecting that both in the write-up, but then also in the rankings. So I think that the rankings have gotten subtly more accurate through that process. And then I'm excited to we're going to only touch on a very tiny fraction of things today, but get into some of these redraft conversations. We have the FFPC redraft dashboard tool from RotoViz pulled up. We're kind of looking at here, sharing post NFL drafts in the Big Gorilla and the main event. In most cases, obviously, ADP is more or less what you would expect. And yet, even if you're expecting it, it's fun to find what you personally consider to be exploitable opportunities. And then there will be a handful of surprises, either in a way where you're like, well, I'm disappointed that opportunity that I thought might be there has already closed. That's never going to exist. Or you're surprised that an opportunity you thought everyone else was going to be on in the same way and would be closed is actually wide open. I'm excited to talk about some running backs.
Yeah. I mean, as you said it there, we were talking about Dowdle a little bit because I brought up to you the Cowboys. I mean, that was the first one that jumped out to me. I have not done a lot of drafting yet to just key this off. And some people know that I have to travel out of state to do some of my best ball work, and I have been not making that a huge priority so far this offseason. And so I was looking at some ADP, and I mean, Jaydon Blue is in these early big gorilla drafts, early ADP. He's an intriguing name. He's going RB 47 in the 11th round. But he's also intriguing from the perspective that Javonte Williams is not going much higher. He's going as RB 39 in the 10th round. He's just inside the top 100 picks here. I think over on Underdog, he's outside the top 100 picks. But I'm looking at this from the perspective of, I mean, there's no Cowboys back again this year going basically in the top 100 picks. To me, Miles Sanders is also a value. He's going much later. I'm not seeing him here, actually. Maybe he's not even on this chart at all when I look through it.
Then people really don't like to draft Miles Sanders.
So Miles, yeah, I mean, that one's weird. We started talking about Miles Sanders versus Javonte Williams. If it's not Jaydon Blue, what veteran it's going to be, talking about their contracts. Yes, Javonte Williams got $3 million. Miles Sanders got 1.3. So Miles Sanders got just a little bit less than half. You were kind of joking to me that it seems like they gave the Javonte Williams contract out, and then they were like, we can't really afford to give everyone a bad contract. It doesn't change the fact that Javonte Williams was just bad last year. talked about it a little bit briefly in the RJ Harvey article. But that was a good example of a player that, to your point about when you're going through stuff, you have to kind of test your thesis. I went back and made sure that Javonte Williams didn't have some surprising numbers that I wasn't missing. And yeah, I mean, he was near the bottom of the league. And I was looking at some NFL Pro stats, but near the bottom of the league in runs of 10 plus yards and runs where he hit 15 plus miles per hour. Anything with any kind of explosiveness, he just was not very good last year. He's the highest drafted player currently in this backfield. Behind him is the exciting rookie that runs, maybe a 4.2, as you've alluded to, Jaydon Blue. Maybe it has some size issues. Maybe that ceiling isn't massive. But I thought that people would be a lot more in on him, I guess. The reason I brought that up is you said maybe some of these backfields where people aren't playing it the way that you expected. I mean, going ahead of both of these guys are, Bashal Tutin is going in round 9 ahead of Travis Etienne. And that to me is fascinating because I think they're probably both values. I mean, I really like the Tutin play, but I also think it's fascinating to look at Travis Etienne going later in round 9. He's still, I think, 25, 26 maybe now. And last year, injury plagued year coming off prior to that 2 1,400-yard seasons. So kind of interesting if that was mostly injuries last year, if he could rebound. In the 8th round, you have Cam Skattebo going ahead of Tyrone Tracy. That one's fascinating too. Is like, okay, well, we're going to take 2 Giants backs in the 8th round, but we're not going to take a Cowboys back before the 10th. And also, I don't know. I mean, these backfields are fascinating. And then the rookie element here in both of these cases. I know you're very into Skattebo, and you've let me know that. Or mentioned to me, give me a little teaser on this article that you've just teased that, I mean, I can't wait to look over. You're doing all your ranks, all comments on basically every player in the pool, but you mentioned to me that a lot of the rookie running backs come out pretty good, which is probably not a surprise to the Stealing Bananas listeners, but that you're a little bit higher on some of these rookie backs than market, Skattebo being one of them. But it's fascinating to me to see whatever your thoughts on those 2 Giants backs in the 8th round, and even if you do believe, like Shawn, you do, that Skattebo should be going even higher, it's fascinating to me to contrast some of those prices with, again, the Cowboys. What happened last year, there wasn't a ton of running back value in Dallas, but Dak Prescott gets hurt. It's not a great season for Dallas. They missed their win total, all those things. I don't think they're going to be massively better necessarily this year. I do think, like, drafters, I think, have a really hard time understanding that sometimes situations are not the 50th percentile average outcome, median outcome. Like, if we think about different outcomes around the league as being normally distributed, I know we've talked about this before, but like, you would expect a good percentage of the population to have been hitting on their lower than average outcome or higher than average outcome, their floor, their ceiling, as we talk about things, right? Anyone who's familiar with the bell curve, the normal distribution curve, knows that a decent, the most likely outcome is landing right in the 50th percentile, but all of the other outcomes combined are more likely than the 50th. You know what I'm trying to say here? And then it's referenced in terms of, standard deviations from the mean. And I can't remember all the percentages, but I think there's a decent chunk of, I think it's almost like a third of the population on a normal distribution is at least one standard deviation away. And so what you're saying is there's a chunk of players that are expected to either have run cold or hot, better than average, worse than average. We've talked about these kinds of that would just be like theory if things are sort of randomly distributed when there's a lot of variance. And we know there's a lot of variance with a lot of these situations. Anyway, something like the Cowboys running back situation not being particularly high scoring last year to me is not something that means that it can't be. To me, it's very clear, in fact, that the situation for the Cowboys, when you think about all the context, Prescott getting hurt, all the other stuff, that it was worse than a 50 percentile outcome, and that what you would expect as sort of the median outcome for 2025 would be regression. We talk about the concept of regression. It would be a better situation, more running back points than what we saw last year. So why are no, and then again, I was going to say, why are none of these backs going higher, Shawn? But there's a back in Javonte Williams that's leading the pack that is an easy one to fade based on all the metrics. So why is Jaydon Blue not more exciting then as the clear answer? Or Miles Sanders? Why is he not getting drafted if you're not in on Blue? Then I think you have to be in on Sanders. What's the deal with the Cowboys?
So Sports Info Solutions has both Sanders and Javonte Williams more or less at the very bottom of the pack in bust rate last year. That's just one element, obviously, of the overall running back profile. But I mean, Javonte also ends up with the most sort of negative WAR. And the WAR is kind of a fun stat in that it's something that is abstracted enough from fantasy that maybe people aren't thinking about that as being as useful, but it is kind of a catch-all for a variety of things that the back does to contribute as a reality player. And my thought would be that when the metrics so clearly give us the same answers that the eye test gives us, that when you're looking at all of these outcomes with the Cowboys, there is virtually no outcome where Javonte Williams is a viable starter on a good redraft team. If the number of
upside
outcomes
is Rico Dowdle, that's the upside.
But it's kind of a setup here. And again, I do think he's probably better than Ezekiel Elliott. But one of the things that Javonte Williams does give you, and it's one of the things you talked about on last week's show, is this idea of him being out there and playing a lot when the team is going to be throwing to do things like pass blocking. And as I was working through this overall project and trying to understand how these guys are going to fit, and I did go ahead and move Javonte Williams up just because the gap between his ADP and where I had him ranked, which was in the 200s, probably doesn't reflect for users just the fact that he will score some points. And you don't necessarily want to have a bunch of players elevated because you're putting all of these guys like Javonte Williams outside the top 200. And then people get the wrong sense of where that next kind of tier is of players who,
I love that.
yes, they're, so it's this idea of upside, but you don't want to present the case that the upside for players who are legitimately like 16 to 20 round picks, that they actually are going to hit. You want people to understand that, you know, occasionally this is very helpful. Usually it ends up like my Devontae Walker enthusiasm where it didn't go anywhere, right? So when you're contrasting like where you should rank a Javonte Williams versus where you should rank someone who basically just isn't going to score any points, the only thing I would say on that is that if you've drafted someone in round 16 through 20 who scores no points and you get away from, that is much better than spending a pick on Javonte Williams still. So however you want to reflect that in your rankings is what you want to do to make sure you're conveying that idea. One of the things that the Cowboys really emphasized, and there were these puff piece write-ups on him where the Cowboys were like, we know that Ezekiel Elliott is not what he was at his peak. We're watching practice and we cannot believe how slow he is. And yet you still need to understand that when we run a passing play, he's able to get to the right spot to pick up the rusher. And you're like, oh, I never wanted any share of Ezekiel Elliott, but now if I could rank him like somehow 800 in a way that people could see that it was 800, I would want to do that, because this justification for why you have him on your roster and are going to play him is extremely disheartening.
It's not good for fantasy football.
Javonte Williams is basically just a slightly younger version of Ezekiel Elliott. Might not even be better, just younger, right? Unfortunately for Miles Sanders, he's also been poor. Now, I think there are structural elements there where you can make some excuses for him. And I do think the explosiveness, by contrast, is different. He probably is the guy that at his price you should take some risk on. But Ben, I think one of the things that's interesting here is that there are three guys. Now, we know that two of them are almost certainly completely irrelevant in Javonte Williams and Miles Sanders, but we also know that they're probably the two guys who take the touches in week one when we're talking about first and second down. And so there are going to be a lot of drafters who do not want to spend a pick on the guy who's going to lead the backfield in points if at the same time that guy is not going to touch the ball on first or second down in week one. Even that, I think, might be conservative in terms of what Jaydon Blue ends up doing. We're already getting reports out of Dallas that he's going to be the guy in part because that's just the only option they have if they want to be a competent team. But Blue is someone who is going to be limited in terms of what I would guess are low value touches. Now, one of the things about having a ton of high value touch, a ton of low value touches, is you can turn yourself into a Joe Mixon. You can turn yourself into a Josh Jacobs. And in specific seasons, those guys will score some. You're much more likely to turn yourself into a Najee Harris. And again, I mean, that could be good or bad, but when you think about Najee Harris and what he's been for people, are there teams that legitimately had league title aspirations and $1 million aspirations who were like, I want to have Najee Harris in my starting lineup outside of his rookie season, where again, he got all the touches, a lot of the high value receptions. When we're thinking about the Cowboys backfield, I think we have the two elements here, which is one, that the prices are being subdued quite a bit by the fact that there's a third guy, even though the third guy is not really being drafted in Miles Sanders. Whereas with Tyrone Tracy and Cameron Skattebo, you can just go ahead and make the argument. I think usually this is a mistake, but this is a unique backfield where Tracy's advanced metrics last year are actually also terrible, which is something I'm not sure everybody realizes. It was a little bit of a shock to me, given that he is athletic. He did have some highlight plays. He did score from distance a few times. He had some games where he was more involved as a receiver, all of those types of things. I was a little bit surprised also when I went back through and pulled up the Ceiling Signals tool on our site, which is obviously reflects a lot of the things that you care about in your write-ups, and found that his high value touch numbers versus trap numbers were not as good as just my perception was, having had him on a bunch of rosters and therefore watched some of the Giants games closer than you otherwise would, because obviously you don't really want to watch a Giants game. And you're saying, okay, well, he's got a profile here that will score. With Tyrone Tracy, there is second year breakout potential to where you would want to have him on some rosters, even if you think he's most likely to bust for you. And Skattebo is as well. Either of these guys could end up falling into a situation where they take most of the touches and then are very good at high value touches. So this is a unique case for me where I'm comfortable overdrafting both of those guys, in part because I think that both guys have a cool profile, and it's a profile where I don't think you're going to get a lot of incursion from other people. How much of what's going on here do you think is a 2 versus 3 situation? And I mean, obviously we think it's wrong, but when you are thinking about Jaydon Blue from the perspective of a guy who probably isn't going to handle a huge number of touches, another player who's kind of interesting from that perspective is Trevor Etienne, who I think should be much more expensive, even though he's only going to handle a certain number of touches. Now, the counter argument would be, well, if you're just saying these like extreme low value touch guys, you're never going to start, why is that different for a guy like an Etienne or a Blue? Are you going to want to start them on a team that has legitimate title aspirations? I guess, Ben, because those touches could be very high value and could be at their peak during title season, that looks very different to me. But again, you do want to consider price. One of the reasons we like Blue and like ETN is because you're not paying that much to find out.
ETN's going RB75 in the 18th round over here on FFPC, one running back slot ahead of Sean Tucker, then Keaton Mitchell, then Kendre Miller. These are guys that are kind of thought of as the third in their backfield, maybe somewhat intriguing, but like the third, or in Kendre Miller's case, maybe just never going to be healthy enough or what have you. And you said, I think on our draft stream right away when Carolina took ETN, that you thought he'd be there too, basically. And since then, we've heard that Jonathan Brooks is going to take the whole year off to get healthy. They've put him officially on PUP at a point in the offseason where that does officially end his 2025 season. He will not be back until 2026. Very young prospect. If Jonathan Brooks does get all the way back, he has the time and the age on his side to still be interesting. Obviously, a disappointing outcome where he tears the ACL in the knee that he was rehabbing when drafted in the second round last year. Re-tears it in his rookie season, and it's a tough break for him to tear it twice within a calendar year. He tore it the first time at Texas, I think the previous November, then I think right before, not a calendar year, but right before a full 12 months was up, he had already torn it again, which was very obviously disappointing for just the luck factor for him. But he's out for 2025, which leaves ETN competing with the Rico Dowdle that we were just talking about, that I was just talking about, is not, I mean, even getting all those touches not being much. And the reason that Rico Dowdle was so cheap last year is going into the year, everyone said this guy is like 25. He's played like 3-4 years in the NFL, and he's basically just been a special teams player and has never actually gotten a lot of work. And even though the Cowboys are sitting here telling you he's going to be a big part of the backfield, it doesn't make any sense. No one's ever done this. No one's ever decided that their 200 carry lead running back is going to be this 3-year special teams guy that has like 30 career touches. It's just bizarre. Like literally no one has ever gone into an NFL season and that's their plan. There's 32 teams. It's like, I can't think of a single time where one of the 32 teams was like, this is our plan. And yet
I think you could argue the Chiefs' plan has been somewhat similar. You draft a 7th round running back who wasn't good in college, and you're like, this is the plan instead. Like,
but they still had the 1st round back on the roster at the time. They still had Clyde Edwards-Helaire on the roster when Isaiah Pacheco.
I guess.
Kind of, I guess. Rico Dowdle is that guy. He gets all the touches. He has a decent year, and Dallas is still like, we don't want you here anymore. We're going to let you go now. Carolina picks him up. That's who Trevor Etienne is competing with. We used to say this all the time in fantasy. I don't know if it's still being said as much, but it's like sometimes when a guy like Rico Dowdle gets added to a backfield, it's a plus for a guy like Trevor Etienne, and that the team is not going to find other competition that might be more of a factor for Trevor Etienne. And so the question then is, okay, Chuba Hubbard goes down or something. Who's getting – I know where I would want to place my bets. It would be on the rookie 4th rounder in that case. It would be on Trevor Etienne. So he would be the handcuff here for me. In addition to what you argued right away on draft night, he's probably going to work into a secondary role at some point in the season. Maybe not right away because they may give Dowdle some of that love. But again, Dowdle plays some on special teams. I'm looking at Our Lads is the depth chart service that I always recommend and I love, and I'm looking at their depth chart right now. The guy they have 4th is Raheem Blackshear. That's their kick returner, Sean. That's not he does not play a lot on offense. He's a big-time kick returner. He's good in the kick returner space, but not a guy that also is going to be a major competition for Trevor Etienne, who again, 4th round pick was pretty decent capital. So anyway, you mentioned Etienne. I love that. We were talking about that a little bit prior to the show. It makes no sense that he's going all the way at the end. Some of these prices just don't make any sense at all to me. And then Jaydon Blue is the other one that you were talking through. And I just want to give the context of the other rookies and their prices, the other intriguing ones, and why I think it's so weird that Jaydon Blue's going where he is and why I don't think he's going to end up there. So if you're drafting now, I'd want to get a lot of exposure to him, frankly. You have Ashton Jeanty going in the 1st round, pick 8. You have Omarion Hampton going at 401 here on FFPC, right at the 3-4 turn. And then in the 5th round, you have Treveyon Henderson at 502, RB19. You have RJ Harvey at 510, RB21. So only whatever it is, 8 picks behind Treveyon Henderson, 1 pick ahead of Quinshon Judkins, who is at 5'11". So 3 backs here in the 5th round, the 3 backs that went in the 2nd round. And then in the 6th, you have Caleb Johnson at RB24. He was the lone 3rd round pick. It is following draft capital mostly, except Judkins is behind not just Treveyon Henderson, but now also RJ Harvey, who has been continued to rise. My argument, and so Judkins, for those who don't know the exact draft order in their head, went ahead of Treveyon Henderson, but both him and Henderson went in the first 10 or so picks of the 2nd round, top 40 overall picks or so. I can't remember the exact number. And then Harvey went much later in the 2nd round, like 60 or 62 or something. And so for Harvey to be ahead of Judkins does break from draft capital a little. He's been getting pushed. People are getting really excited about him. We're both very excited about him. That's because of the situation in Denver and what they had last year and what the opportunity may be and who he could be to that offense, a Sean Payton offense, etc. Maybe people are just way more excited about the Broncos as a running back scoring situation. But that same thing that is bumping Harvey in these early redraft rankings here, that's pushing him ahead of Judkins and not that far behind Henderson, who I think people are very excited about as well. I just don't understand why that same element isn't pushing Blue, and I think eventually it will. We always talk about this around this time of year when projection season comes around. I'm going to start doing my projections pretty soon. It's a big reason I'm excited to have this conversation with you as I start to think about how these teams are going to shake out. I think if you go into the Cowboys projection and you don't come away from it with the same kind of mindset that I was talking about was the Alex Collins fragility in those old dead zone articles around Javonte Williams. I mean, I don't know how else you couldn't. I know that's how I'm going to come out of it. Whatever I'm projecting Javonte Williams for from a touch perspective is basically going to be me doing lip service to the fact that they did give him $3 million. And I do think that they think, or I don't know if lip service is the right word, but whatever. They think he's going to be their lead. Are they going to play him, or they're going to, think about him in the same context as they thought of Zeke last year, and they continue to play Zeke. And the Broncos continue to play Javonte Williams last year when he wasn't good. And there's things that he does as a running back. But whatever work I'm giving him, I'm basically saying it's low upside, and it's not because he's not going to do the primary job of a running back, which is make plays with the ball in your hand, because he's not going to do that well. And when I say primary job, I want to be clear. When I wrote up the RJ Harvey piece, I went and dug into Javonte Williams' numbers. I think he averaged 6.1 pass block snaps per game per PFF. So again, primary job was the times that he was touching the ball. 6 pass blocking snaps a game doesn't necessarily justify a huge role if there's another back that's taking that away from you. There wasn't one in Denver last year. At least Sean Payton didn't feel that the other backs could take that work. If Blue is good in any kind of way, they just play him. And maybe they can't play him on pass downs, on obvious 3rd and longs or whatever because of pass block issues. He did grade poorly in that regard. But the ways that a pass down or pass block specialist running back fit into an overall snap split and snap share situation, there's grades, right? There's gradients, there's variations of how these snaps can split out. I mean, they were using Hunter Lipke last year. They're basically their fullback on some of these pass downs as the only back to kind of pick up. Like they could use Javonte Williams on those plays, on those very obvious plays. But Blue could pretty quickly manage, I think, a pretty significant snap share that just gives up some of those very obvious pass situations. Frankly, Sean, I think he might have more potential to get to the 75% or 80% snap share than even RJ Harvey, who we really like, because Peyton has always kind of liked to mix it a little. He believes, I think, in running back freshness, although I'm bullish that Harvey will be able to do some of the things that, Kamara eventually did in that backfield. But to the point about Kamara, that's a guy who I remember about 4th or 5th year of his career when he first finally started hitting 80% snap shares with consistency. I remember writing about it in Stealing Signals that was a notable thing for him. Last year, I think, was his actual career high in rush attempts. Because, early in his career, even when he was a fantasy monster, which could be the case for an RJ Harvey, he was playing like 65% of the snaps because the way that Peyton does still rotate everything. Blue maybe only has the upside to get into that range. Maybe he's not a guy who can actually get to 75 or 80%. But I do think it's interesting to think about these two backfields in conjunction to each other and the things that are pushing up Harvey and not stopping his rise are there's not a lot of competition. There's a lot of opportunity here for the things that matter, even if it's not an 85% snap share for Harvey. And I guess I just think the Blue situation, it's not the same, but it's a diet version of that. And yet nobody seems to care. He's not being pushed up at all. There's like no pressure on him to rise. Why is he not going in like, I'm not saying the 5th where Harvey is, but the 8th or the 7th, somewhere within shouting distance of Harvey? I just don't understand that. In relation to these other rookie prices, including like a Caleb Johnson, the 6th, who you've mentioned maybe isn't as much of a target as some of these other rookie backs.
And I think there's a possibility that I end up just being completely wrong on this because the Steelers have never really seemed to understand how good Jaylen Warren is. But he's basically the only veteran back that I look at as a big value, because that's the only situation we're looking at here where the rookie and the veteran should, not even that they should be flipped, but you can certainly make the case that they should be flipped and that you would want to be getting some Jaylen Warren exposure here. It's really weird that Najee Harris, who is, unless things are completely wrong with Omarion Hampton, is dramatically worse than him, that he would be going in the same spot as a Jaylen Warren, who probably is about the same as Caleb Johnson, right? That's a situation there where the backfield is just not, and basically Hampton should just be more expensive. Harris should be less expensive. That's one that doesn't make a lot of sense. I did want to ask you though about Blue, in that I want to make sure we're not ignoring this element where he's not even really a running back, that he's not, and I say not a running back, he's a running back, but he's just not a workhorse. And very clearly, one of the reasons that I was shocked that he went where he did and Brashard Smith went where he did is that Smith basically averaged twice as many rushing yards per game. And otherwise, these guys are exactly the same player. I mean, Jaydon Blue might be even a little bit faster, right? I mean, the thing with Jaydon Blue is that he is just extraordinarily athletic. But can we see with the Dallas Cowboys an Alvin Kamara-like outcome? Because you do need a somewhat specific environment for a young pass-catching back to emerge. You talked about how he might not be in on some of these pass-blocking situations. And I'm looking at his profile, which is almost entirely receiving-oriented, and thinking that if you're not going to be out there on receiving plays, that's a problem. But I don't think it's going to happen that way. I think it's going to be much more similar to what we got from Chase Brown last year once Zach Moss got hurt, where it finally freed them up to use him as a receiver as well. Because previously the gap between Brown and Moss as a runner was so great that they're like, if we're going to play Moss at all, we need to be as a receiver. Once he gets hurt, you can just use your explosive back on both things. But on the third and longs, they would just bring in an H-back type of player and let him block. Those aren't going to be passes to the running back, or at least not the way they had their offense set up. Now, you could argue that's still a little bit of a concern, because what you'd really like is for those plays to also be potential dump-offs where the defense is down the field. They just are trying to stop the first down. It's 3rd and 15. They're willing to just give you 8 yards. And then you get 1.8 points in fantasy. And that is equivalent to much more difficult ways to score points as a runner. So you work through how that kind of thing can play out. I do think there's a possibility that the George Pickens acquisition is very positive for Jaydon Blue, in that the team will just be more dynamic. One of the problems that they had last year, and one of the reasons why my thesis on Dallas running back in 2024 is basically just don't draft any of them. You're not getting a big enough discount for the fact that they probably just won't score hardly any points, was that they did not look like a good offense. They had CeeDee Lamb and then a bunch of guys who should be clinging on to the last roster spot on NFL teams who were out there playing a bunch of snaps, both at receiver and at running back. They probably will be more dynamic in 2025. Now, part of it is just the QB health, but the passing game should be more dynamic. That should open things up for a back specifically like Blue, who runs a 4.25, as opposed to guys who, I mean, are just not athletic anymore. Can we get this kind of emergence from a Jaydon Blue, Brashard Smith type of player in a way that most of us are kind of expecting from RJ Harvey? Are we going to get that on some other rosters in 2025? Because that's a big part of my Trevor Etienne thesis as well. The reason he's so inexpensive is that he was the lesser part of committees in college, but in some ways that was tactical, because he was very good when he was actually touching the ball, somewhat similar to a James Cook, who now is a fantasy star.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of examples of this type of player, actually. I mean, I think the pinnacle that we talk about a lot is like the Jahmyr Gibbs, right? Like, because that's a team that's used 2 backs, and they've used David Montgomery in a lot of the like hammer role. And for whatever reason, all of last year, they continued to use David Montgomery on the first drive always. And then it was like, well, but from here on, Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be our 65% back. And that's pretty much, it would wind up 60-40 or something, but it was because they always gave Montgomery that first series. And then from then on, it was like 2-1 towards Gibbs. And I guess Montgomery really was softening up the defense in that one series to start most of these games. With the Cowboys, I think the comparison is Tony Pollard from a few years back. And in Brian Schottenheimer's first year as the OC, he's now the new head coach. That was the year that it was Pollard's last year in Dallas 2 years ago. Schottenheimer was OC for 2 years, so 2023. In 2022 was really Pollard's breakout year, and he was incredibly efficient, but he only had 232 touches. That was a career high for him to that point. 1,378 yards, 12 TDs. 2023 had another 1,300-yard season, but didn't get to the same number of yards from scrimmage. Half as many TDs, only 6. It took him 75 extra touches to get there. His first 300-touch season, 307 touches in that year. my point is people may not remember how poor Tony Pollard was in his final year in Dallas after he had been so fun, but that was the Schottenheimer year. They kept giving him the ball over and over and over again, despite the fact that he finished with a yards per carry more than a yard lower than the year prior and a yards per target in the pass game more than 2 yards lower. And he's a smaller back and those types of things. They gave him a ton of work in his first workhorse season. It was his first year over 230 touches, only his second year over 170 touches, and they gave him a 300 touch season. Then last year, under Schottenheimer, they gave Rico Dowdle 274 touches. Another guy who just was not. You said, are we over or understating this idea that Jaydon Blue is just not really a running back? And he's not really. If you look at his data, or he hasn't like gotten the touches necessarily, but like. That's what the Cowboys have basically made workhorses out of other guys the last 2 years anyway. I wouldn't just be overlooking that in Blue's profile on any of the other 31 rosters is the point that I'm saying. I think that's, for me, it's strongly a Dallas Cowboys point. And Blue did have, a decent number of touches last year overall at Texas. The 2 years prior, again, he was behind the big workhorses, Bijan Robinson and then Jonathan Brooks. Last year, he has 176 touches overall. 42 of them are receiving. It's so funny to look at his game log, as we've talked about on the show, and I think we talked about last week. He has like a 25 carry game at one point. He has multiple other in the teens. And then he has games like this game against Georgia where Texas lost to Georgia in the regular season. He didn't get a single carry, but he caught 7 passes for 48 yards and a TD. I mean, he was out there as their pass catching back the whole time. No carries and a 7 reception game. He was the most receptions in his career. It was the only game he played in 2025 where he didn't get a carry. But again, they were kind of playing from behind and they were treating him as their passing down back. And so, I mean, his role or his profile is very unique in that regard, that he did have some games where he got a lot of work. And I guess I don't know. I think I'm viewing that differently. I think that the Cowboys probably are viewing that differently. When you think about how they've constructed their running back room, I don't think it's well, but I think they think it's good enough based on what they did last year, right? I mean, they don't seem to believe that the backfield requires profiles that are significantly more defined or better or have shown other things than they'll just give the ball to the guys that maybe don't necessarily deserve it or shouldn't be getting that many touches, or however you want to frame that. Anyway, the Blue thing could pan out poorly from the perspective of him not just being very good or not being efficient in the way that Tony Pollard wasn't able to handle a huge workload or something like that. But I don't think it will be bad because they don't think he can handle work. I think they've shown us they'll just make whatever player they think can handle the work into a workhorse, if that makes sense. Maybe that's an unfortunate misread of the situation. But I also wanted to say I really like your point on Scatabo and Tracy, as well as the comparison between the Steelers and the Chargers. The Steelers and Chargers one is really interesting in the perspective of Jaylen Warren's obviously better than Najee Harris. And yes, Najee Harris has been a big workhorse over his years with the Steelers, but he's now on a 1-year deal with the Chargers. And then they went and drafted Omarion Hampton higher than Caleb Johnson, significantly higher as a first-round pick. And Hampton's going at the 3-4 turn. You said he should be going even higher. I don't disagree. Caleb Johnson's going in the 6th round. And yet Harris is going ahead of Jaylen Warren so far. It just doesn't make any sense to me that even with Hampton maybe needing to go even higher, Hampton's the higher drafted of the 2 rookies coming in. He is going significantly higher than Caleb Johnson right now. I mean, he's going 2 plus almost 3 rounds higher. Why would Harris be going ahead of Warren? That's the thing. I mean, it's maybe a little bit more faith in the Chargers offense, but in both cases, the reason I like this comp as well, we don't expect there to be a ton of receiving value for the backfield. It's probably going to be a little bit disappointing in both cases, the way that they structure, certainly the way that Arthur Smith structures things, but also low-key the way that Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman structure things. And so you get into this, I don't know. The Najee Harris RB29 and Jaylen Warren RB31 thing I thought was a great comparison to draw. And then your point about Scatabo and Tracy, it is a unique backfield because Tracy comes off of a successful rookie season, and typically we don't necessarily see this exciting of a prospect dropped on top of that. But in his own right, we've talked about this before. Sometimes you need to just look at the individual profiles and say, what is the Tracy case? Well, the Tracy case is this coaching staff really liked him, played him a lot last year, played him over Devin Singletary, even though in some ways Singletary wasn't doing significantly worse because, as you said, they were both. Well, I don't know. You didn't mention Singletary, but Tracy wasn't necessarily crushing in the peripherals and those things, but they were giving Tracy a lot of work. They wanted to get Tracy a lot of work and play him and see what they had in him. And they took Scadaboo in the 4th round. It's not like they went out of their way. He didn't get 2nd round draft capital or something. So it's not like they went out of their way to replace Tracy necessarily. But Scadaboo does a lot of really fun things. He's a guy that plays on passing downs. I know you really like the advanced profile. You've talked about that a lot. Anyway, it's looking at Tracy specifically, it's easy to make the case that as a year 2 back who got the work he did, it's the same coaching staff and all of those things. He can catch the ball, as you mentioned. You have that receiving profile in addition. He's worth investing in the 8th round as well, or at least considering in the 8th round. Let's talk about I want to talk about the Patriots a little bit because you have Treveyon Henderson going in the 5th. You're really, really high on him. I want to talk about Ramondre Stevenson. He's going in the 10th. He would be the Najee Harris or Jaylen Warren of this comparison. He had some really bad numbers last year. A lot of concern there. He does have something that Treveyon Henderson doesn't necessarily have, which is more size. Does have a nice contract. It's not going anywhere. It's a new coaching staff. I guess I think Stevenson, 2 rounds later than like Najee Harris, is the same play as Najee Harris and probably a better version of it. In redraft, probably not one you really want to make. I've been trying to toy with him in best ball, but we are talking about this more specifically from a redraft lens. Do you think Henderson has as clean of a path to really displacing Stevenson as Hampton clearly does? I think is the 1st round pick. And the market seems to really buy with Hampton going at the 3-4 turn, Henderson going early in the 5th round. Certainly the market's buying that to some degree as well. But do you think he has as clean of a path, maybe not as much of a 3-down profile, just from like a weight perspective, et cetera. And then with the 2nd round draft capital, do you think that Henderson will be able to displace Stevenson as easily as the market seems to think that Hampton will Najee Harris?
I think so. To me, Henderson is probably the most interesting play in the early rounds of any back, because you're talking about a player who in some ways is a rich man's Jahmyr Gibbs coming out of college, right? I say that from the perspective of we can probably count on him as a pure runner a little bit more. Now, one of the things with Gibbs, and very fortunately for us at RotoViz, because we wrote all these articles about how he was the best selection in any kind of format you were doing, but he's hit toward the top end of his range. And as a runner, you could even make the case that Gibbs has been a little bit disappointing in commanding receiving volume at the NFL level. Some of that is just how many good receiving teammates. There was just another blurb out about how Jamison Williams is going to break out. And you're like, how? Like, how? There's only so many footballs, which on any given play is 1, right? Like, how is he going to break out? The Patriots are an interesting team because they don't have all of that talent. And yet, because they have a very competent coaching staff now in place, and they have a very interesting young QB. I mean, Drake May could be anything from fine and mostly underwhelming to an absolute star. And if he's a star and he opens things up for the Patriots in a similar way to the way to what Jaden Daniels is doing, what obviously you get from Josh Allen, then Treveyon Henderson is off to the races in this amazing way because the offense moves the ball, which I think is a crucial part to the Jahmyr Gibbs thesis. I mean, you think about Gibbs, and one of the things that we just wrote up again and again last year going into year 2 was that you can think of this as being similar to Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram. The Detroit Lions are going to score that many points at running back. And even if David Montgomery has a good season, which he basically did, one of the things that's kind of mind-boggling is that David Montgomery put up fantastic receiving numbers last year, which again, doesn't quite fit in with, the first thing that pops to mind for him, even though that is in his background as well, even coming into last season. Can the Patriots score so many points that you can make Henderson work and that maybe you have volume for both players? For me, the part that is maybe the most confusing, or I think will be the most interesting, is that we get to find out how much of what Josh McDaniels has done in the past is related to the specific personnel they had with the Patriots, where a couple different times they do try and make a splash at running back. It more or less doesn't work. And then they're going with these committees of somewhat similar low end, not really starters, but not maybe pure backups, guys who are talented enough. Certainly when you put them into the committee, they form a good committee. But when I'm looking at Stevenson, one of the things that is interesting to me is that in McDaniel's previous tenure, the one from 2012 to 2021, the New England RB2 scored over 100 points in every season, scored at least 136 times. On 5 occasions, the RB3 scored 100 points. In a lot of ways, I think that actually works out better for Ramondre Stevenson than the situation for, say, Najee Harris does with the Chargers, where I would expect Harris to just be completely squashed by midseason. At the same time, I do think that Stevenson is probably not nearly as good as David Montgomery. And so if you intend to go with that type of a split, and then one player is simply a star, the other guy tends to lose some work. It's also a thing where you want the Patriots to be explosive, and yet are the Patriots, is there any real scenario where they can be as explosive as the Lions? Because part of what was happening with the Lions is that if you're that good offensively, then you can afford to give Montgomery some touches you shouldn't give him. Now, one of the things that's interesting, you can pull this up on the different game splits and team splits apps we have at RotoViz, or obviously you can find other places, but their offense went into hyperdrive when Montgomery was hurt last year, and it gave a very clear picture of how much it was hurting their offense to use him as much as they were. The Patriots, I don't think, will necessarily be in that position. When we look at Stevenson, we know he had bad superficial numbers last year. We know that he fumbled a lot. One of the things that was interesting to me when you dig into the advanced metrics is that a lot of the advanced metrics from 2024 were much more similar to 2022 when he averaged 5 yards per attempt than last year where he's under 4. A lot of the receiving numbers, which are really bad in 2023, reversed themselves to an extent in 2024, which again kind of goes to your point that Stevenson's 2024 was probably not as bad as it looks on the surface. And when you have a guy with size, a guy who, fits a very normal NFL role, and someone who you have this contract obligation to, he probably plays quite a bit.
Yeah, I think the contract part is something that probably gets overlooked a little. And I'm looking at that range here, and you have Trey Benson going at RB40, which I think is an interesting name there. And didn't do a whole lot last year. I would have thought that people would have been a little bit more concerned about him. Like, I'm comparing it to Marshawn Lloyd, who's another exciting, I believe, day 2 prospect from last year. Lloyd was hurt all of last year, but in some ways it's almost like you can tell yourself more of a story that because he was hurt that he has a way back. He's going all the way back at RB56 in the 14th round. Benson's going in the 10th. And those two guys to me are like, they're both backing up. Maybe Lloyd doesn't have as clear of a backup role, but it seems that people are probably too confident in Benson having a clear backup role after what was, I think, a disappointing rookie year from a usage perspective for him after real significant draft capital. And then Jordan Mason's the other one, RB37. Yes, the Vikings went untraded for him. They still have Aaron Jones. He's going RB26 in the 7th. Vikings backfield, I think, will be pretty valuable on a 7th rounder and then a 9th rounder for the probable backup, but maybe committee back. I understand the Aaron Jones concern, but both Mason and Benson to me are, to put it in context, they're both going ahead of Jaydon Blue. Mason's going ahead of Javonte as well as going ahead of all of the Dallas backs. That's another team that has 2 backs going ahead of anyone on Dallas. I feel like in those situations, I can get around to the Mason thing, I think, pretty easily. And I could probably get around to the Benson thing. I guess I just think there's some inconsistency here. There's some profiles that are being elevated. There's some interest from drafters in projecting a guy who didn't do much in Benson's case, or in Mason's case, a guy who did a lot last year, frankly, but then was traded and is now on a new offense. We don't necessarily know how he'll fit in. Projecting them into roles that they haven't really been in yet. But then there's other guys people don't want to project into roles, like the Marshawn Lloyd point. I brought up Blue again. You brought up Brashard Smith, who's going back at 58, RB 58 in the 14th round. We talked about like Trevor Etienne, who the role seems to be there for him as the RB2 probably. There's just a significant number of players that I think, DJ Giddens, who you love, looks like the clear handcuff, round 14 guy. Maybe I don't understand the ordering of the different backs. A lot of these guys to me seem like they should be sort of in the same tier, and there's really defined gaps between where they're going.
I think there are a couple of things to take away from that. One is that the upside and what you are buying from a scenarios perspective is not being efficiently priced in the early going. And so you don't even have to be right exactly, other than you probably can exploit the current ADP by simply taking the players who represent the exact same case but are heavily discounted, stockpile them. You know that they're going to rise. You probably are going to have some hits with those players. I think we have this interesting question of, if you have a backup, if you have a guy who's mostly a handcuff, the standalone value probably exists, but it's not a huge part of the way the guy is being priced. What is your preference on taking someone who was uninspiring as a rookie, but now has some experience, versus someone who doesn't have experience and maybe wasn't drafted that early? You have a lot of guys here who aren't being given a lot of credit because they were not drafted early in this elite draft class, but we also don't already have feedback on them that is bad. So I think that's an interesting question. One of the backfields I think is interesting because it brings a lot of these things together is this Los Angeles Rams backfield. Currently, Kyren Williams is going at RB11. He's going early in round 3. I loved him there at that price last season. That more or less worked out. You can tell that it worked out by the fact that he's priced there again. Running back picks that don't work out really lose a ton of value the subsequent season. But it's interesting to me that I would view the 2024 thesis and the 2025 thesis dramatically differently. In that when Kyren Williams is going into 2024, he doesn't have as long of a track record, or really much of a track record at all, of very poor peripherals on a big sample at the NFL level. He had a bad season last year. He had, purely from what he did when the ball was in his hands, where he had one of the highest negative WARs in the entire NFL. The evasion numbers were through the floor. The explosiveness is more or less non-existent. Now, because he does do some things well, and I think that you could argue that he's able to slide through some creases, he's able to make something out of nothing every once in a while, he's able to score touchdowns. And a lot of that is fluky, but some of it is a real kind of nose for the goal line thing that is a skill and might carry over a little bit more than people are thinking. I don't think that we want to frame Kyren Williams as being a bad player who should be drafted significantly lower simply because he's a bad player. That wouldn't be the entire part of my thesis. But there are a number of moving pieces here in that in 2024, he was competing with a rookie who didn't have a particularly good prospect profile other than having been on a national championship team. So with Corum, you get a little bit of that Clyde Edwards-Helaire-ish glow, where he's viewed a little bit differently simply because the team he was on was so good. You also have the case in 2024 where Kyren Williams is basically competing with one player, and that makes a difference because from the perspective of the team doesn't necessarily know, you don't necessarily know as a fantasy manager how good that player is, but if that player turns out to not be that great, then you've got the moat. You've held on to the work. One of the things that was interesting last year for Blake Corum is that even though kind of eyeball testy, I thought that he looked bigger and more explosive on the carries, he actually also had very poor metrics where he didn't have a single boom rush all year. Now, just the 58 attempts, but with the 58 attempts, you'd like to have one that generated a full, 1.0 EPA. The evasion numbers were low. The yards after contact per attempt were low. He was stuffed at a higher percentage than Kyren Williams. There was nothing really in his profile to say Kyren Williams needs to play. However, there wasn't a lot from Zach Charbonnet or Tank Bigsby going into last year that would make you think that they were going to be the second-year breakout guys. And they did emerge in part because they had better profiles than Corum, just simply not like elite profiles. Year two is maybe where you would have expected them to break out. Maybe Blake Corum, that's where we would expect him to be. But the problem here is that they've also drafted Jarquez Hunter, and unlike Corum, Hunter has a fantastic profile. And there are some differences in terms of what he brings to the table that will allow him to be a complementary piece in a different type of way. So now we have more information on Williams. We still have the possibility that Blake Corum could hit on a high-end outcome in terms of what his second-year range is. And you have this third player who's probably better than Corum, might be better than both of them. That for me is just very different in terms of what the scenarios actually are for the 2025 season. And my thought would be that Kyren Williams should be priced very differently than he was a year ago.
I love that take. I think I want to talk about Alvin Kamara because I think it's a very similar case in that their situations are significantly different. Although in his case, the pricing is different. Last year, he was going a little bit later, maybe around 6, around 8, and he did hit pretty well at that cost. Now he's going in around 4, and it's almost like drafters are overcompensating for having him too low last year, but he's about to turn 30 here in July. I also want to note that last year, I mentioned this a bit ago, I think I said he had a career high in rush attempts last year. He didn't quite hit a career high there. He had a career high in rush yards, and he had a career high in total touches. He had 68 receptions. He was second among all backs in receptions. He played 10 of his 14 games with Derek Carr, who's a guy who's always checked down to his backs a decent amount. I was just pulling up the Game Splits app to check how he did with Carr versus when Carr was out. He actually caught more passes when Carr was out, but his rushing numbers absolutely cratered. He averaged half as many rushing TDs per game and about 50 fewer rushing yards per game, despite catching a few more passes, in part because the offense was probably really pretty bad, and there was some dump-offs and things late in those games. But that's sort of my point, is you look at Kamara going into next year, you're talking about a Saints team that's looking to potentially start the worst starting quarterback in all of football if they go with Tyler Shuck right away out of the gate. He averaged Kamara about 5 PPR points per game less in the 4 games that Carr missed last year than the 10 he was in. He was over 20 PPR points per game in the 10 Carr games, 15.25 in the 4 games that Carr missed. And like I said, that was some of that was due to touchdowns. More of it was due to yards. I mean, 50 fewer rushing yards per game. Had fewer receiving yards per game as well, even though he had slightly more receptions. But for the record, he had a ton of receptions when Carr was out there as well. He was pacing for an 80-catch season with Carr and played 10 of his games with Carr. And so I would actually argue the 4.7 catches per game over a 10-game sample, I mean, again, is pretty strong evidence that a huge part of his receiving profile from last year was due to Derek Carr, who had a long history of passes to the backs. When you were talking about the third back under McDaniels having some production with the Patriots, I was thinking in my head, well, Tom Brady was there. You know, I've always talked about the quarterback has a big impact on the running back receiving profile. There's some of these QBs will get down and check down quickly, and we see a lot of running back scoring as a result. But the Saints offense is just better with a competent quarterback as well. We'll see how their season plays out. I think it's a significantly worse situation for Kamara to back up what he did last year. Never mind the fact that the reason he was going around 6 or 8 or whatever last year was the reason that we should be concerned again this year is that he's an aging back and he's got a ton of work. And he didn't even make it into the fantasy playoffs last year. He had a great year, but he only played 14 games and didn't finish the season. He has not played more than 15 games in a season since his first year as a rookie in 2017. He always misses a few games. And now he's 30 and he's coming off the most touches he's ever had in his career. And they have a new coaching staff. And now we're saying this 30-year-old back, we're really going to buy back into and push him into the 4th round, RB16, where his situation last year, if you wanted to make a case that you're going to overlook the age and take on some risk and those things, I think that case was last year, not even considering cost. And I didn't necessarily like it at around 6 or around 8 costs, but I do think the situation with Derek Carr and around the team was a little bit better. The Saints, for some people, were a pick to win the NFC South last year. Like, they were expected to be reasonably okay. That is not so much the expectation this year. And the ways that Carr specifically helped his receiving profile and those things are just not going to be there.
I mean, when you're talking about the Saints, NFL teams are good. They have a lot of talent. So the games, even with bad teams, do end up in many cases being fairly close. You're going to be competitive in some games, but I mean, the Saints are tracking for like an 0-17 season.
They look like they're going to be really bad. And the reason that Kamara didn't get back on the field at the end of the year was they were so bad that they kind of just shut him down. Yeah, I'm having a hard time with this. I just pulled up Super Bowl odds to try to understand maybe what I'm missing. I don't think the win totals are out there yet because the whole schedule isn't out there. It's about to drop. I think maybe today or tomorrow. I don't know. As we're recording this, maybe it's already dropped as you're listening. But looking at the Super Bowl champion odds, Shawn, the Saints actually are dead last, 300-1. The Cleveland Browns are 250-1. The Jets are 200-1. So there's like a lot of times at the bottom of these things, there's like 3 teams that all have the same like bottom tier odds, like they're all 250-1 or something. But like the odds makers are like, yeah, we have all these teams that are really bad, but the Saints are even that much worse. They're 3. If you want to bet on the Saints to win the Super Bowl, we'll give you any price you can name. Like that's what they're saying. There's no faith in this offense. And their lead running back, I guess because people are like, well, you guys said this about Kamara last year and he was good. All right, fine. Go ahead and overcorrect and take him in the 4th. I won't be drafting him there.
Well, and it gets back a little bit, too, to this idea of what else do they have? And one of the reasons that I missed on Alvin Kamara is just the corresponding miss on Kendre Miller, which I think you can make the argument that they even separated from each other. Both takes were wrong. So, you've got to kind of own that, I think. But when we're looking at where they are for this season, it's fascinating to me in that I think this is where it's very important to actually understand the profiles of the players and not just their draft positions. We did a show on this last week. Ben, you got some good feedback on it. I'm excited about that. You were fantastic in the show. One of the reasons that I actually like Joe Mixon's ADP this year, I won't draft him, but I certainly think it's fine, is that they added Woody Marks, a guy who is not an NFL athlete. Now, I think that you could make the same case maybe about Devin Neal, but Devin Neal's background, even though one of them went at 116, Houston has a really long track record of drafting backs who were not good college players, which is not how I would recommend doing it. Neal went all the way down at 184, but he was one of the guys that you're looking at where a starting role for him at the NFL level would be no problem. He's not going to be a difference maker for you, but he can certainly handle that role. And that changes the dynamic for Alvin Kamara as well as they are working through what will happen next. And based on what Kamara has been as a runner, you can look at it from a number of different perspectives. One of the reasons we didn't like him a lot last year is that his peripherals as a runner have been really bad for a while. There's a huge break for Kamara from 2017 to 2020 versus what he's been in 2021 to 2024. Now you can still take what he's been during these most recent 4 seasons because of what he's been able to do as a receiver, the compiling there, but he has to have that because the rushing peripherals, as he's gotten more work as a runner, have been terrible. And they were not good again last season. Again, his WAR last year was awful. Devin Neal is a guy that a rebuilding team is simply going to want to see in a lot of those rushing touches. And even if they are low value touches that Neal gets, they probably will be low value. You take enough of them away and you move out of that range where you can be a viable pick at that price based on workload, which is really what Kamara is now. And he's morphed from this really exciting, dynamic efficiency play in the first 4 years to something just very dead zone-ish sense.
Yeah, they also have, I mean, don't laugh, but they brought in Clyde Edwards-Helaire at the end of last year. I say that from the perspective of, you mentioned Neal. Kendre Miller was nothing last year. They got no other help. They'll have Taysom Hill presumably back healthy, or maybe not. I don't know. So I guess he was a little bit of a minor nuisance for Kamara last year. My point is, again, to this point of how things actually play out, whether it was the 50th percentile, median outcome, like Kamara saw basically no threat to anything. You're mentioning it could be Neal. I'm saying Miller could be, I know we've all heard the Kendre Miller thing every year and it's whatever. It could be a delayed, he was a 21-year-old prospect. He's still very young. It's possible that he actually stays healthy and plays some football at some point. If it's not him, it could be CEH, who's the third back with Neal. I mean, like, it seems in most outcomes, whether it's Neal or even other guys, that Kamara will have more competition behind him. Maybe not real threat to his role because they're going to play him. He's Alvin Kamara. But enough that he can't just be super inefficient and set a career high in touches again and all of those things. And on top of it, he's old and has to stay healthy and didn't last year when he was taking on the bigger workload than he ever had. And so I don't, how does 2025 look better than 2024 looked? I understand that 2024, you got an outcome that was better than his price. That doesn't mean 2025 looks better. Understand the difference between outcome and process, I guess, is sort of the point. Yeah.
Well, we don't love the outlook for Kamara, but what about some guys who are more exciting? Guys like Breece Hall, like Chase Brown, like James Cook, like Kenneth Walker. I mean, these are extremely talented backs. When we think about that type of excitement versus situation, where are you on those guys versus Hampton, a player we said should be going earlier, Henderson, Harvey, Judkins? I really like Chuba, but I guess I don't quite understand how he can be in the same mix with Treveyon Henderson and RJ Harvey. But even the guys earlier, guys like Cook and Brown and Hall, is there any risk that some of our favorites are actually still overvalued in comparison to rookies?
I mean, definitely, I want to hear your thoughts on Breece Hall, because definitely he stands out to me from the perspective that the team was talking about potentially trading him, right? They brought in multiple backs last year. Obviously, we have a whole new regime there, but they may not see Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis as a tier below Breece Hall on their depth chart. They may see this as we have 3 good backs, and we're going to kind of see how things go. Breece Hall is incredibly talented, but is coming off a tough season. Drafters still thinking about what he did in 2023 and what his ADP was going into 2024. He's going RB12 right there in the first half of the 3rd round. that's aggressive to me in an offense that also so much of his production's been dependent on receiving, and it's going to shift the offense to where Justin Fields is the worst quarterback in the league for running back receptions in my mind. I was just talking about how different quarterbacks are positive for that. He does not get through his progressions to the running back. He'll take a sack or he'll scramble. He's looking vertical, and then the ball's not going to leave his hand after those downfield progressions.
You don't want to drop it off to someone who's less athletic than you are.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to run. I'm super fast. So Hall is tricky for me from that perspective. You mentioned, I think Kenneth Walker is still a really fun one. You still have Zach Charbonnet there. They didn't do a ton to replace him. I think he could be pretty exciting if they just get him running more downhill, obviously. It's a little bit concerning that Charbonnet is a more downhill runner and more aggressive and more vertical, and the team may eventually care about that enough that may impact Walker. But Walker's just so much more talented as an overall runner, and what he can do when he does get downhill is just so much more dynamic than Charbonnet. That, I mean, Charbonnet looked good last year. He was better than I thought he would be, but I think Walker is an intriguing pick in that range. So those are the two names that jump out. The other one I would say is Chase Brown. You mentioned, to me, when I was talking through some of the other rookie running backs earlier, I skipped over Taj Brooks' name, but to me, Taj Brooks is really intriguing. Bigger back. Samaje Perine about to be 30 and has struggled over both of the last couple of years. He lost his role with Denver in 2023 and then didn't ever get a role really with the Chiefs and get a foothold with the Chiefs last year. Bengals are familiar with him. They bring him back home, but I don't think he's a guy that you would expect to be the full season third down back. I think he'll start the year there. I think it's a pretty strong expectation that he won't be that secondary back in December, basically, that you would see that shift. I would be impressed by him if he was able to play the whole year, Perine in that type of a role, which leaves Zach Moss, whose health we don't really necessarily know, but does seem favorable. Maybe Moss is a real threat to Brooks, but basically my point is Brooks is going really pretty late. He's going in round 15 right after Jerome Ford and Roschon Johnson, and Ollie Gordon is going a little bit ahead of him. Gordon maybe also interesting. Right ahead, Brooks, right ahead of Woody Marks, who you just mentioned is not the most exciting player. Right ahead of Jordan James, who Isaac Guerendo is going in the 11th round. A lot of these guys are RB3s. Again, Brooks is going back in that RB3 range. Like I mentioned, Trevor Etienne. Etienne's going a few rounds even behind Brooks, but to me, Brooks is an RB2 going in an RB3 range for reasons that I don't really understand. But along with that, I think it's an emphasis on Chase Brown not really having Chase Brown's like the Kyron Williams of this year, where we probably don't have a real threat to that role. And people still don't necessarily want to buy into it because of the individual profile of the player. But Brown was good last year and was in that role, and the team didn't really come after him with what they did in the offseason. So I think I probably am buying his his round 3 role just based on looking at the ADPs of the other players in his backfield and how the market is telling you they're not really buying anyone to come get his role. At first, there's a little bit of sticker shock with Chase Brown in the 3rd round, but it's a good team. It's a good offense. They're going to have points. Joe Burrow is one of those quarterbacks that will throw to backs. I've written about this before, but he weirdly has really, really high completion rates to every back that plays with him. Every back that plays with him catches like 80+% of the targets, which for a running back, the average is usually about 75% or a little bit lower in the low 70s. He's had several backs at different volume levels, meaning when he gets down to his check down, he gets down to it at a time where they have space to catch the ball and he dumps it off with some touch and in the right spot. Those are not hard balls to catch for any NFL player unless you make them hard at the quarterback position by waiting too long until someone's bearing down on them, or you throw it with too much velocity or something because you're kind of rushing through to your check down. Burrow's got feel for that and real touch for dumping it off to the running back position. Anyway, just minor note, but one of those things that does help the running back scoring for the Bengals. I like both Brown and Brooks, but I also think if you look at them in conjunction, and the reason that I like them both is like, it doesn't really add up. It's sort of not enough draft capital overall for the Bengals backfield.
Yeah, I mean, I'm tracking almost identically with you on all of those. Breece Hall and Kenneth Walker both had very high stuff rates last year, which even if that is basically on the blocking and the offensive scheme, it is going to stand out to coaches as something that they don't like. And so that's the reason that Charbonnet is closer to Walker than we feel comfortable with. And it's a difficult range to take someone who probably is just in a committee. Breece Hall, if you're going to put those other two guys anywhere close to him, you just can't pick him in this range, which is all. I mean, I can't believe I'm saying that, but just the profile no longer works at all. For him, the other peripherals as a runner were not good last year either, at least for Kenneth Walker. Walker is such a weird guy where he hasn't really made it work yet, but you would still expect him to make it work in the future, where he didn't do basically anything as a runner last year, despite having easily the highest evasion rate in the NFL. If they fix some of the things that they have going wrong, both with the blocking and with the tactics, you could see him be the next guy that breaks off like 5 60-yard touchdowns. And then suddenly people are like, why didn't you draft him in the first round? We knew he was talented.
And so halfway through the year, when we did our midseason check-in for the 2025 ADP, that's where he was. That's what he looked like halfway through the year. Do you remember that? Like, I think you had him as the RB1 at that point. And I had him in the top like 4, clearly, because he was playing that way. Just from that point forward, things did not go well for anyone in the whole offense. I mean, it didn't go well. They
that
fired
makes me
their
really
offense.
Sad that you have brought that up just to think about the massive fall. Because that's what that's what it is. It's a massive, massive fall.
But it's a half season fall is the important, I think, emphasis as well, that if he rebounds from that, as you're saying, and he has a great year, and we're asking later, why weren't you drafting him in the first round? That wouldn't surprise at all. But I think for some people, it feels like that would be more surprising than it is. He's going behind Kamara. That's weird.
So you look at some of these guys, the Chase Brown one to me, I think a different, just another way of looking at what you said with the sticker shock is that, to my mind, when you're thinking about talent and what they provide a team as a runner, I think that Chase Brown is sort of halfway in between what you get from a Jahmyr Gibbs and what you get from a James Cook. And you could even argue it's a little bit weird that's a little bit how he's being priced, right? Where he is more expensive than James Cook, which may not hold all year long if any of these disagreements with Cook and the Bills get ironed out and, there's no problem there. But the difference in the way that the other two players were drafted and what they did instantly, certainly for Gibbs, a little bit less with Cook, but he came on with all of the big plays last year. I guess my concern is simply that perception always tends to stick with a player. And if you have a down stretch and you're Jahmyr Gibbs or you're James Cook, probably nothing happens. If you have a little bit of a down stretch as Chase Brown, the team is going to be like, you know what? As you just mentioned, Taj Brooks gives us this. Why don't we lean a little bit more? So my concern with Brown would simply be that maybe there is a moat issue that doesn't exist for some of the other players being drafted in the same range who were early picks on their teams. The team clearly wanted them as the guy right off the bat, which is the case for some of these rookies too, where you think about Hampton, you think about Henderson, you think about Judkins, you think about RJ Harvey, and the teams are basically telling you, we think this guy is a star. And then what that means for everything around how their performance is viewed. I do think that we have an interesting situation here with Cook, even if everything kind of gets worked out with the Bills, it isn't an issue. One of the things I stumbled on using the screener and trying to understand how much of the efficiency came on certain big plays was this I thought it was an interesting note to me where Derrick Henry and Bucky Irving combined for 16 runs of 30 plus yards last year. 2 of them went for touchdowns. James Cook had 4 such runs. All 4 went for touchdowns. The explosiveness is hugely helpful. Whether or not you're going to always get touchdowns is maybe a little bit of a different question. He had over 4 rushing fantasy points over expected on only 11.5 overall. So when you're thinking about it from sort of a bulk perspective or however you want to frame that, the more rushing EP you have, the more FPOE on a per game basis you can also have, because you're getting more chances to create that fantasy points over expected. I don't necessarily think the Cook is going to fall off. I don't necessarily think he's a bad play, but we do want to keep in mind something that last year was very hard to keep in mind with someone like a Devon Achane, where there you have an explosive runner, scored some long TDs, averaged crazy yards per carry numbers. 2023, he was at 6.7 purely rushing fantasy points over expected per game. In 2024, and Achane is another one that was interesting because his rushing peripherals were bad, at least from the stuff perspective. The Dolphins went from a team that opened up these gaping chasms for their runners to run through to one where just like a stuff was inevitable. And Devon Achane still was at 2.1, which is not bad, even though he was getting stuffed constantly, right? But that change from 6.7 to 2.1, when you're talking about more than 4.5 points per game that he lost just in efficiency numbers, I'm a big believer in chasing the explosive running backs, chasing their efficiency. We just want to make sure that we're always staying at least somewhat calibrated in terms of how likely the true extremes are. One of the things that was interesting, I have the note in the article, but Derrick Henry is also coming off of just crazy numbers. You go back and you look at all the backs who have been in that range, it is tough for them to maintain that, with the exception of Derrick Henry has actually done it many times. So he's an interesting just thing almost entirely unto himself, which similar to, although in a different way than Kamara, because he still was utterly dominant. But when you're in your 30s, I mean, you think about someone like a Travis Kelce, who it's hard to really fully conceptualize and internalize just how bad he was last year, because he's been so good for so long and so good deep into his 30s, to kind of finally get to that point where you're like, oh, Travis Kelce is not even a good player now. It does happen at some point.
Yeah, the Derrick Henry thing, I remember a few years ago trying to explain to him so many times over so many years, and finally coming to the conclusion and stealing signals that the only comparison I could give was Jim Brown, which people are going to be like, oh, well, you're just like throwing out some old name. I mean, the context being, if you go look at Jim Brown's career, he only played 9 seasons, but he played 9 seasons. He led the NFL in rushing yards 8 times. He led the NFL in rushing yards per game all 8 of those years. He led the NFL in rushing TDs 5 times out of 9 games and carries 6 times out of 9 seasons. All-time career leader in rushing yards per game. That's what Derrick Henry's peak and frankly his whole career has looked like, where it's just like, I mean, he's going to lead the league. he's led the league in rushing yards twice, touchdowns 3 times, yards per game twice, overall rush attempts 4 times. Only reason he didn't lead the league in rushing yards again last year was obviously he had 1,900. Saquon had 2,000. No one else was anywhere close to those two. So he was second in the league. He wasn't the league leader.
Off-season,
but he's had this.
Derrick Henry.
What was that?
Off-season.
Yeah, an off-season. He's had 3 years of 113 plus rushing yards per game. I mean, that's just crazy. Over the course of a full season. I guess the 1 year it was the injury shortened season, but still, I mean, just last year was another one of those years for him. But yeah, he's a fun one. This has been a fun conversation from the perspective that I feel like the ways that the running backs could be ranked this year, there's a lot of different ways. I don't necessarily think it's efficient yet. I think there's some significant like tier breaks and groupings this year that aren't necessarily being reflected in early ADP. And so in terms of how to play it, I mean, I'm certainly interested in drafting the studs in the first round, like a Jahmyr Gibbs or a rookie or a Gene T, or obviously Bijan and Saquon are going in the top 3 picks here. One of the guys I'm really looking at, and I'm curious your thoughts on, is Christian McCaffrey at RB5 going 202. I could see that being the worst idea or the best idea. The rest of the second round is, I mean, I don't know. I'm just trying to think through like the dead zone and the rest. There's some names in the second round that I'm scared of. I'm not gonna lie, Bucky Irving at RB9, Sean. I'm gonna want to have access to Bucky Irving for sure, but that one's another one that feels aggressive. Like Rachaad White's gonna still play. Like he still played last year quite a bit. He's still gonna probably play a decent amount. Sean Tucker's there. They have talented other backs. Love me some Bucky Irving, obviously. And I think he's going to be very good on whatever work he does get. But this is a team that can rotate the work a little bit. And we know Irving isn't an elite athlete. So he makes a lot of incredible plays because he makes a lot of guys miss and he can extend plays and those things. But it's not like you give him a little bit of space and he's gone necessarily.
Like the two. So I mentioned the Henry and Irving 16 rushes of 30+ yards and only 2 touchdowns. You can also separate that back out and be like Bucky Irving, 0 touchdowns. None of them ended up in the end zone.
That's exactly how I'm envisioning his big plays last year. It's like he's running diagonally away from a defender that's always got an angle on him, and that's a tricky thing in fantasy. He's still a star, and I'm super into it, but man, at 210,
I think that it works when you go back through and look at what his profile was coming in, how he performed right away, and then what his workload was when they fully committed to him. At the same time,
that's a big part of it because the workload part of it includes the receptions and the Baker Mayfield aspect, and this backfield is really valuable.
It's really valuable. I think that Irving and Brown are appropriately priced. The question is whether even early you can win with guys who are appropriately priced, as opposed to generally still trying to unearth the guys who are going to take another jump and are going to be next year's 105. And it's really hard. And I've moved a little bit away from this because I think that the pricing and also just the way football is being played, something that you and I have done quite a few shows on over the last sort of 3 years, moves me off of this idea that you can never chase. And never is always too strong of a term too, but you try not to chase your 0 RB hits the next year because they go from massive league winning hits to vaguely trap-ish players.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that even if you go through the stats and you're like, I think the thesis works, you want to be aware of how you got there in the first place, what the risk is for all these early running backs. For me, if you're going to spend a pick in this range, the reason you take Christian McCaffrey, even with the risks, is because McCaffrey is a very straightforward 25 point per game player if he plays a full season healthy and things go right. The other players that you're looking at, you're like, this guy could score 19 points a game if he stays healthy and everything goes right. That point gap is so utterly massive that it changes completely what you're looking to do and why you would take a risk. So I do like McCaffrey early. I have him ranked barely ahead of ADP, which is basically just saying that in this spot here where Brian Thomas and Amon-Ra St. Brown are going, I would be okay taking him. Mm-hmm. I don't think you have to by any stretch. In some ways, I think you probably would still prefer to have Trey McBride, who is the person who goes immediately above that. Tight end is the position where it's tough to get. We've done some shows on elite tight end. We won't get into a ton of that today. But part of what we're looking at here then too, and I do think is interesting, and certainly something that we did on our teams last year more, was that there are a variety of elements that have made it more viable, at least for me, to have hybrid teams, to have teams that are less 0 RB-ish, basically to have teams that take all of the flexibility and contingency-based parts of 0 RB, all of the things you can weaponize to increase your ceiling and to decrease your risk, to create all of these asymmetrical outcomes that are priced very favorably for you, to take those things and move it away from an approach that gets fixated on just taking all of the receivers, in part because I think the running back scoring relative to the wide receiver scoring at different price ranges makes it more compelling to have some running backs and then to have your 0 RB guys, where if you hit on both sides of that, then you simply are going to have a lot of running backs on your roster that you actually want to play. And if you have that, then you also want to consider how much sense it actually made to load up on wide receiver just for the sake of doing it. Now, that's never how we approach 0 RB, but you have to watch that mindset of letting it ever become that. And then finally, for me, there are some wide receiver prices that make absolutely no sense. And if I'm going, at least for me, again, as in terms of how I'm ranking players, if I'm going to grab those receivers at those prices, then it frees me up to take running backs in some places I would not have taken them in the past.
When you talked about the 0 RB, not chasing up the 0 RB candidates, you said trying to look for this year's version of that. To close, who is your Bucky Irving of this year? If there was one, there's got to be one. I got a name in mind. I'm putting you on the spot. If you want me to go first, I can go first.
When we think about I'm not gonna frame it that way. I think that Jarquez Hunter is set up very similarly in that Kyren Williams is a lot better than Rachaad White. Is he good enough to hold off a better back? Does the team see it that way? The Rams are right back to thinking that they're the best team in the NFL for 2025. If they have a better player than Kyren Williams, they will play that guy. Jarquez Hunter, a player with extraordinary peripherals. A really, really good running back, an athletic running back. I mean, basically, he's Bucky Irving with some athleticism. Now, obviously, Bucky Irving has the athleticism. It just doesn't test well. But Hunter doesn't have that issue either. I mean, this is such a fun class. There are like 6 guys.
Yeah.
But as we've had that conversation earlier in the show, I'm going to come back to Hunter and say, I don't understand the price in any format. I'm going to keep trying to take it here and hope it stays the same as long as possible.
It's scary for me because I kept taking Jaydon Blue in Dynasty over him, and I didn't get Hunter anywhere. I only have like 5 Dynasty leagues, but I didn't get Hunter anywhere, and I was like, man, I don't love that. And now you're saying he's going to be the 105 next year, basically, to wrap around that take. I was going to say Bashal Tutin, which isn't like a huge surprise. He's going 5 rounds higher than Hunter. He's not quite in that Bucky Irving range, but I just meant in terms of that context of you saying, who's that guy that's going to be the 105 next year, or going to be in the first round, or going to make that huge, huge jump. I think the more and more that I think about it, the more and more I get excited about Tutin. I still think, again, I've said this, that ETN, that it's just kind of weird with him and that he still could be a value and things could still work out for him. I don't think highly of Tank Bigsby, and I think most of the stuff that suggests, even in the advanced metrics, that he was really good last year is a little misleading when you watched him from a week-to-week basis. He had that really good game against the Colts at a stretch when the Colts had a lot of injuries and couldn't tackle anyone. And like Tank Bigsby was the poster boy for that point, where he had like multiple touchdown runs with several broken tackles that people were talking about were the best runs of the year. But it was also like, this is just bad defense. And there was a lot of play in Bigsby's season where he was like a replacement level running back, and people kind of just wanted to overlook that and be like, well, he's taking Travis Etienne's job. And I remember in Signals writing a lot like, yeah, Etienne's hurt. He's not worse than Bigsby. I mean, Bigsby doesn't look meaningfully better on a week-to-week basis or a down-to-down basis. So anyway, Bigsby probably less of a threat to and all 3 of these guys are going between RB 36 to RB 45. So it's drafters are throwing their hands up a little bit, but new regime comes in, identifies Tutin. Apparently the GM, James Gladstone, had said Tutin's name in his interview as an example of a player that you might be looking at on day 3. They end up taking him right at the beginning of day 3. Liam Cohen obviously was coordinating that team last year that had all those fantasy points in Tampa, where Bucky Irving was able to find a huge role, even as he was splitting some of the backfield at times because it was such a valuable backfield. I think the Jags have the potential to be a pretty valuable backfield as well. You certainly can't guard. You can't focus on and key on the backs and when you have Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter running routes, right? And so they're going to have the ability to stretch defenses and create a lot of underneath. And I think Liam Cohn's offense is going to set that up for gash plays for the backs. The more I wasn't like that into Tootin, but the more and more I think about it, and I know you've had Scatterbo ahead of Tootin, and I like Scatterbo, but man, I think I would take Tootin over Scatterbo straight up. I think I would take Tootin quite a bit higher than where he goes as this like moonshot swing. Maybe he will be going higher later in the year. We'll see. But
yeah, keep all those opinions to yourself, Ben.
Okay.
You've already articulated them on this show. Never say them again.
All right, I'll keep those to myself.
The Jaguars.
I also really liked your case for Devin Neal. I mean, I think you could throw him out as well. As the Saints are going to suck, so it's not going to be as exciting as I just described. The Jag situation could be really exciting. That's the fun thing about Hunter. If he does get in that role, I mean, the Rams' backfield is definitely one that will elevate over a running back's true talent, what he's viewed as. I mean, I don't think Kyren Williams would be what he is in most backfields. I think the Rams have helped the perception of what Kyren Williams is. Anyway, it'll be fun. It'll be fun. I'm excited. Redraft season is going to be fun, Shawn. It's upon us almost.
It is. So we'll be doing some more, as you mentioned, draft content. We'll both have articles out somewhat soon on our redraft. Maybe not full game plans, but certainly thoughts on early opportunities for drafters. This has been Stealing Bananas. I am Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. Make sure you are subscribed over to bengretch.substack.com for your full Stealing Signals experience. We'd love to have you guys over RotoViz. Coupon code RVRadio2025 for 10% off your 1-year sub. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.